Why media should talk about climate crisis?
Today, there are in none of the mainstream television channels are there reporters or journalists who have, who are climate or environmental journalists. The biggest tragedy that has come about because of that is that we do not have a nuanced understanding of what climate change and its impact means to Indian audiences.
How the climate coverage has improved over the years. Could you tell us more about that?
Climate change, health, environment, they are receiving more attention and have become more center stage, especially when it comes to health after the pandemic or when it comes to climate change after the Paris Agreement of 2015. It's unfortunately been a lot of talk and not so much in terms of action, especially when it comes to reducing the amount of greenhouse gases which is resulting in global warming.
Most of the migration that happens in the country is due to climate. How do you connect climate to human rights, and do you think that we are covering enough in that aspect?
We are covering enough, but we are not reaching beyond that point. The point here is that you have to look at the largest aspect. When the people have moved, what has happened to the ecology, what has happened to the economy, what has happened to the agriculture. So that entire spectrum should be looked at. Right now, what is being looked into is just the livelihood.
The victims of this climate crisis are marginalized group. They don't know it's like their migration or their crisis is due to a climate. There is a climate angle to it. They're not quite like they're not aware about it.
I don't think that the issue is that marginalized communities or communities that are most affected by climate change, these are issues that are connected across for everybody, whether you are living in an extremely urban and sort of privileged area, because it is coming home there as well with the floods and the air pollution and all sorts of impacts that you see with sea level rise, like along, say, Mumbai's privileged coastlines.
A very warm good afternoon, everyone. Before I introduce our next session, I would like to thank each and everyone who are present here. Most of you are our subscribers, and we are always grateful for your support. Thank you so much for joining us. Now let's move on to our next session. We all know that climate change is real. From melting glaciers to rising sea levels and annual catastrophes, climate change is one of the biggest stories of our time. Yet, it is significantly underreported in many newsrooms, and the reportage that exist often lacks depth and nuance. We need to talk about climate change, and we definitely need to address why many newsrooms are still not weighing it enough, which is why this panel today will explore what works and what doesn't in climate reporting, and how to build a more systematic approach to such journalism rather than event based. On our panel today, we have Jacob Koshy, who's the deputy editor at The Hindu. He writes on science, clean energy, environment, and climate linked issues. We also have Mukta Patil, who's the project editor at the Locavore. Her work spotlights the intricacies of India's food systems and how they interact with the climate emergency, the environment, and people. Also joining us is Shailesh Shrivastava, a senior editor at Mongabay India. A journalist since 2007, he was previously the editor of India Spent, managing editor of 101 Reporters, and assistant editor of International Business Times. We are also joined by Sibi Arasu, who is a climate reporter with the Associated Press. He writes on environment, science, climate change, people's rights, and other related developments. As the moderator of our session, we have Haritha John, who heads the Kerala Bureau of the News Minute. She reports extensively on the environment, planetary health, politics, religion, caste, and human rights. Let me welcome our esteemed panel and our moderator to the stage.
Thank you all for staying back. Yesterday, someone has challenged me saying that it's a climate change session post noon and nobody will be interested. But yeah, I see. And I'm so happy that you stayed back. So, coming to climate change coverage in last 1 decade, it has improved a lot. We see more investigations, more headlines, and more stories in this region. But is it enough? Is climate crisis being overshadowed by other news cycle? Keeping all these questions in mind, let's straight dive into the discussion. Hi, welcome all. So we have here in the panel, this climate change can be considered as an umbrella term. That in the panel we have uh, the journalists who work on different areas of climate change. It's different intersections of climate change. So I think we can focus more on how climate change can be covered than than a technical term. It can be covered into different focus, different areas, different intersections. So let's start with Shailesh. Shailesh, you come from Mongabay, which is an exclusively environment website. So we have this issue of sidelining climate crisis or environment reporting by the mainstream media. I'm not saying like all the media, but yeah, some of the media. Yeah, we get only a few percent compared to the other news coverage, the climate report. So you come from Mongabay, which is exclusively for environment. So why do you think that it is so important to have websites like non-profit websites like Mongabay in climate crisis reporting?
Hi. Uh, First of all, thank you to the organizers to have us here. Me and my organization, definitely. Okay, so I will say that yes, we are exclusive to environment. It's difficult to have an exclusive organization for environment, and definitely there are brilliant outlets that are doing good reporting. But I just want to say one thing, Haritha, is that right now the coverage is being very, very focused on climate change, right? Because that is the buzzword in today's world. What news outlets are not doing are like focusing on the base of this, which is the environmental reporting, right? If you don't do environmental reporting, focusing on the larger environment, ecology, biodiversity, and the basics of science, we can't do climate change reporting, because climate change reporting is the like the the dome of the building, right? So you can't pick the dome and not see the foundation or not focus on the foundation. So yeah, that's we will get to that later. That's where the money is. But yeah, that's my first take on this one.
Mukta has a different like focus on climate change, right? She focuses on food systems. And how is it like, how is the coverage at your organization, how is it related to climate change, and how the audience are accepting it?
Can everybody hear me? Okay. So at the Locavore, we sit at the intersection of food and impact. And what we found is that food becomes a very accessible sort of lens for people to engage with broader issues and structural inequities. So climate change being one of them, environmental damage being one of them, issues in the agricultural system being one of them, consumers being very far removed from producers being one of them. And all of these are parts of what the climate change conversation should be, like Shailesh was saying. And so we realize that when we are able to focus on this aspect of it and talk about and do our storytelling through this lens, we are able to stop speaking of it as an event-based thing, which is something that often happens in mainstream media, and look at sort of structurally what is happening across the country with food producers, with farming systems, and connect it to our everyday choices in some way, so that people are also able to in some way feel like there are actionable things that they can do in order to combat some of this in whatever capacity they can. And so by being able to do this, and I also want to say that we are not a traditional newsroom, and we don't storytelling is a large part of what we do, but we also engage in many different ways with stakeholders across the food value chain. And so we're able to bring in many different perspectives and connect the dots across the value chain, which we find really important. So oftentimes, even if you're not able to see the words climate change in the stories that we're telling, it is very much about the climate crisis and how it is impacting food producers, consumers, and everyone along the way.
Jacob comes from a traditional mainstream newsroom that focus on climate science and environment reporting for like over the years very ardently. So do you like, who are your audience, like who are interested in it? Because we see that in many of the media don't cover climate just because they think that people are not interested, only a particular community or a particular group are interested in climate reporting. So do you think that it's true? And when we talk about like why media should talk about climate crisis, which are these media who are not talking about climate crisis?
Yeah, thanks, Haritha. So, first of all, a general observation is that it is a general truism for newspapers that the newspaper reader is most interested in topics that are inversely proportional to what it actually means for their daily lives. I mean, we have inordinate interest in politics, though it doesn't always have a direct influence on most people's lives. But things like health, environment, and I would even argue science, things which shape and or civic issues, which is a slightly better covered off. So the struggle that certain beats have within mainstream media spaces is just a facet of human nature. I mean, that is just how our brains are wired to consume news and deem what we want to spend our time reading for. But that said, I completely understand that I come from a very privileged position in the sense that the Hindu, since the 19th century when it was set up, has, always aspired to write on subjects and issues that go far beyond just immediacy, beyond just politics, etc. So we've always had a science journalist. We've had veteran science journalists. There might be one or two through the years. But now, even in my current, I mean, there's me who was based out of Delhi, but I have colleagues in Chennai, our headquarters, where he's somebody who mans an entire science page, where that includes not only science-based stuff, but even climate, environment, medical news. And what is also interesting is that we're not just taking news off international pages or something like that. We actually commission journalists to report and write on issues that are very closely connected to environment or even deep science. Now, the bigger problem that we face is today I can honestly say that at least in all of the print newspapers, and again I speak from a very Delhi perspective, but most of the legacy newspapers all have at least one or two journalists who specialize in writing on science and environment and have been doing so for many years. We have separate people who write on health, for instance. These are all now valid beats. But that said, when we are, especially the way we have used the term media over here, it, as we were just discussing earlier this in the day, media in the general sense now actually means television or some form of screen, for, where news is consumed in a visual format. And it is quite sad to, for me to observe that, at least today, there are in none of the mainstream television channels are there reporters or journalists who have, who are climate or environmental journalists. We have the occasional science editor, but this was not true even 20 years ago, even 10 years ago. I mean, we had people in television outlets who used to specialize in science and environment journalism. The biggest tragedy that has come about because of that is that we do not have a nuanced understanding of what climate change and its impact means to Indian audiences. We generally just tend to extrapolate the European understanding of climate change, which is glaciers melting and sea levels rising and temperatures rising up. We extrapolate that into Indian context and assume that that is what is, the same nature of of fear or threat that it poses to, in Europe, it plays out in exactly the same ways in India. We could discuss that later, but I think that's one of the calamities, but happy to elaborate in future.
But one more thing, like the legacy media did not have to worry about the metrics, right? So
Metrics.
yeah. So the who are the audience, how many are reading it. So that privilege legacy media had. Maybe that is also a reason.
Well, now is no longer is that the case, because we have our own websites which deal with their own economics. As previous panels have discussed, ad ads are fickle. I mean, it is a consequence of many other factors that have very little to do with with the kind of stories or the reportage that we do. People themselves are having major questions on how stories should be covered, or how arguments should be lined up. So yes, we probably had a great run at some point of time, and which is why organizations could invest, because they were all considered investments, because we all realize that these are important aspects of our daily lives. Yes, the Hindu has a lot of readers or young students who actually use our material to prepare for their civil services or other competitive examinations. And so that has an effect on the kind of content we also do in terms of giving out explainers, etc. So it is not a in the Hindu is always, like all other papers, relied on ads. I mean, we are at a lesser privilege, for instance, compared to several Scandinavian countries, where the government actively allocates a certain proportion of its budget to media outlets, irrespective of whether they are state or private funded. So, and examples of the BBC, for instance, etc. So we've always had these tensions. Ads were never easy then, and now too, but it's certain principles and that determine how organizations decide what to cover.
Sibi, you were talking to me about how the climate coverage has improved over the years in last one decade, considerably increased. Uh, and we see a lot of investigations coming up in the global south. So could you tell us more about that?
Sure. Thanks. So I would actually say that climate change, like what Jacob was saying, like climate change, health, environment, they are receiving more attention and have become more center stage, especially when it comes to health after the pandemic, or when it comes to climate change after the Paris Agreement of 2015. And frankly speaking, the incredibly catastrophic number of disasters that are happening ever more frequently across the world, and of course in India and other parts of South Asia. So it's inevitable that they are becoming more kind of mainstreamed and becoming, if not core beats, very very close to the core coverage of any large scale, at least, media organization or a news agency such as the one I work in. And in my personal view, I think it's also become extremely important geopolitically because of China's role in kind of leveraging clean energy over the last decade or so, or a little bit more. And China has leveraged clean energy not only as a way to transition away from fossil fuels, but also as a way to kind of escalate their importance in the world order, like becoming, most people might know, but in case they don't, like the country supplies over 95% of all clean energy related products to the rest of the world. And also, like electric vehicles, etc., China is the world leader. So this whole climate conversation attains a lot of significance because of its geopolitical relevance. And this is the maximum, I would say, it's been ever, really, like where these two, these two very important sectors of public life are interacting so closely with each other. And I would also say that despite all of this, and despite the increase in maybe ink used in broadsheet for climate news or in the digital space, there is also, I feel, as a journalist, a lot of fatigue among readers when it comes to reading about climate related issues. And if I take a step back, and if I think of myself as a reader, I can understand and sympathize with this, because there has been, as I just said, like increasing number of disasters claiming so many lives, affecting all of our lives in one way or the other, whether it's extreme heat or floods or like anything else. However, in terms of the amount of greenhouse gas emissions that are going into the atmosphere, it is not really reduced as much as it should, even though there have been signals sent by various parties over the years. In terms of actual action, I don't know. I wouldn't blame if people think nothing much has happened. It's unfortunately been a lot of talk and not so much in terms of action, especially when it comes to reducing the amount of greenhouse gases, which is resulting in global warming. However, when it comes to increasing the amount of energy produced by clean sources, there has been a lot of action in that sector, but I feel that's mostly driven by market forces who see a great opportunity there. So this is the large framework I think is going on right now.
This whole geopolitics talks have overshadowed the actual climate change discussions. Uh,
I mean, like honestly, I think Jacob was alluding to now. Like news cycles are so short-lived now. Like, do we any of us really know what was in the news cycle last week? Especially given, say, Trump and their government's antics, or like any other major news-making person or organization. Like it's very difficult to say that one news agenda is overshadowing another, because news memory itself seems to be shrinking, I feel, in recent times, especially as visual consumption of news or consumption of news through social media platforms increase. The longevity of any one story is like shrinking, is my personal opinion. And when it comes to climate coverage, I think it is receiving the space that all of us here and you are trying to like kind of push and kind of trying to publish. I think it is finding that kind of space. Like the Hindu would carry an important climate story in its front page and as well as prominently on the website, or the Associated Press carries important climate coverage prominently for through the news cycle for that day. However, in terms of how often that happens, maybe it's less often than say like other geopolitical issues. So I feel the verdict is still out. I think I would actually say the question is not so much whether climate coverage is being pushed out by, say, geopolitics or something else, but how news consumption itself is evolving incredibly fast. That I honestly think all of us within a decade or so are going to be performing very different roles. In my organizations itself, we are now producing content in multiple formats, encouraged to come on the camera much more, because consumers and readers trust a person telling something rather than just reading it. So I think like climate is being as affected as any other key coverage area. I don't think it's being superseded by any other one particular beat, especially now.
Shailesh, I wanted to ask you about, like, we know that climate is not a niche topic. It is interconnected to human rights, as you said, child rights, women rights, migrant rights. So most of the migration that happens in the country is due to climate. And there are studies that climate change is directly affecting the maternal health, mental health, physical health of especially people who are in the who are the common people. So how do you see climate, how do you connect climate to human rights, and do you think that we are covering enough in that aspect?
The question, like, are we covering enough?
On the human rights
Yes.
perspective,
Yeah.
you, as you
So,
said, you were talking about child rights and how child rights is
yeah.
drastically violated over climate
Yeah.
crisis.
Like, are we covering enough? I think we are covering. I don't know. I think the previous session was also uh, talking about like how much is enough and how much is over. Uh, I think personal opinion, we are covering enough, but we are not reaching beyond that point. Right now, what we are covering is that, migration is happening from Bihar, migration is happening from Jharkhand. So we are covering the same topic from different geolocations, right? I think what needs to be done is that uh, the impact should be studied a little deeper. Let's say if a community is moving from Bihar, right? So right now we are just reporting that, right? But what needs to be looked at is that what is happening in that village from where people have moved completely. What was the previous village economy, right? And what is it right now? And see, Miss, at Mongabay and personally, we cover environment pretty deep. Means we eat, drink, breathe environment. Uh, the point here is that you have to look at the largest aspect. When the people have moved, what has happened to the ecology, what has happened to the economy, what has happened to the agriculture. So that entire spectrum should be looked at. Right now, what is being looked into is just the livelihood, right, and the movement of people. Mm, I will give you an example. I was in Kashmir last week. I was traveling from Zozila to Sonmarg. On the way, we stopped for lunch, and there was a big bus coming, stopped for lunch at the same place. I saw people talking in uh, Bengali and bit of dialects of Jharkhand. And then I asked them, where are you from? They said, Jharkhand. And why are you here? They said, the construction of Zozila Tunnel. There is an entire bus which, with a contractor picking them from Jammu and taking all of them. Now we have to look at it that which village they came from and what is the situation of that village right now. And I'm presuming that only women are left in that village, right? And the economy is completely in a different shape then, right? The Because all these places where the men are the driving forces of the economy are taken away from that area, right? So I think
um, also like these are like the victims of this climate crisis are marginalized group
yes.
who contribute very less to the emissions. And yeah, they don't have like they have very least like they are the factors of emissions, but they are the marginalized group. And are we able to reach up to them and do like they don't know it's called like their migration or their crisis is due to a climate, there's a climate angle to it. They're not quite like they're not aware about it. So what can we do to that bridge the gap between that science and the common people, like,
Completely agree. Completely agree. I will quote three examples from India. Also, one personal thing which I have been thinking about is that we, at different COPs, we keep talking about loss and damages. And the loss and damages debate or the conflict, I would rather say, is between the developed nations and developing and underdeveloped nations, right? But there should be one more climate loss and damages angle which should be looked at is within the nation, the rural versus urban. Like you rightly said that the people who are emitting less are bearing the larger brunt of this crisis. So that is one thing. I will give you the examples of it. If there are people from Bangalore here in the audience and Karnataka, there is one very big project going on, which is called KC Valley Project. Right? This project basically takes the treated water, the treated sewage water, to the lakes of Kolar. Now, Kolar is the groundwater level is pretty low and all that. The government said that it is going to fill up the tanks of all these lakes, and that will give the water security to these villages. Now, the point is the first proposal was that this water should be tertiary treated. It should be treated 3 times, right? Now, the government said that we don't have money for tertiary treatment, we will do it 2 times and send it. Our ground report from Kolar said that this water is not usable. People are suffering there, but no. In the name of water security, it has been given to the villages. Now, the Kaveri water supply from Kaveri to Bangalore, I think it is running in the 5th or 6th phase right now. If you can bring fresh water for Bangalore all the way from Kaveri, can't you do one phase of Kaveri water for Kola? It's almost the same money. But no, you won't do it because those people don't have larger voice. Similarly, all these buses, the roadways buses, when they lose their fitness in urban areas, they are not taken out of off the road. They are taken off the roads of urban spaces. They are taken to rural spaces that are better off. The air quality is better. You take all these emission laden buses to rural places and put them there. Can't you do electric bus programs, or can't you introduce new buses to these places? So this is these are the examples of, pushing them even further from quality of life, and we are not, the policies right now are not making it easier for them.
I actually also want to present a counterpoint to what you said, in that I don't think that the issue is that marginalized communities or communities that are most affected by climate change, that the job is to connect the dots for them. They're very much aware of the impact that this is having on their lives, and they're the first people to be extremely vocal about the kind of development and the kind of support and the kind of systems that they would like to have in place to ensure that they are able to not migrate or live a life of dignity. And so I don't think that that's where the problem lies. The problem is that when you talk about climate change, or when you talk about issues like Jacob was suggesting, that these are issues that somehow feel far away, and perhaps newsrooms then need to consider what you are doing to bring it closer to your lived lives, and to be able to understand that these are issues that are connected across for everybody, whether you are living in an extremely urban and sort of privileged area, because it is coming home there as well, with the floods and the air pollution and all sorts of impacts that you see with sea level rise, like along, say, Mumbai's privileged coastlines. But I think the problem is that it's only when that happens that you are then able to pay attention to it. And perhaps then, as newsrooms, we need to consider how we are telling our stories in a way that we are able to foreground people's voices and experiences in a better way, if we are the conduits to connect what is going on the ground, or with marginalized communities, or with women, if you're talking about gender, and being able to talk about it and connect it to policy or what needs to happen to make it so that human rights are engaged with, or there is dignity. Even if there is migration, is there a plan to do it in a dignified manner, right? And so orienting reporting and kind of questioning whether you are able to do that, and if that is the direction that you want to take as a newsroom and make it part of your mandate, becomes really important, that introspection.
So, but to
It's okay. No, just wanted to add on something that the other. No, I just want to say that one thing, I am noticing, and maybe others will agree, is telling human-centered stories when it comes to environmental climate reporting. I think they have a lot of traction across the world, across our country, and finding stories that reflect a larger issue. For example, we reported a few months ago about indigenous women in eastern Odisha coming up with maps, what they call so-called dream maps, about how their communities are getting affected by climate, and also what are the kind of changes local government can make to make these situations better, help them adapt, or even prevent, mitigate climate impacts. And placing these indigenous women from this region in the center of our story, we noticed that it traveled really far, and people across the world could relate to it, especially when you do it in a multi-format way, where you have powerful graphics, images, videos, interviews, etc. So I think climate, like any other issue, if you tell it in a way where a person is at the center of your story that you're telling, I think that story can have a longer shelf life, for one, and also the story can kind of affect the reader far more, have far more impact in the reader's hearts and minds as well.
I just wanted to
The fatigue
Exactly. Yeah.
around climate
Exactly.
change
However,
reporting.
however, counterpoint to the same would be that you can't keep telling these stories all the time because of the investment it requires to do this. And of course, people are concerned about news in terms of breaking news as well. Most, that's a large majority of news consumption is breaking news. So you don't really have the space or time to
one of the
tell this.
challenges which I face while reporting climate crisis or is that when we talk about climate action, we also the human rights in the other way. So sometimes we feel like it is put in a way that the climate action can be anti-human rights. So there's anti-environmentalist because you are taking away if action the climate action requires some kind of displacement or some kind of evacuation or something, yeah, but if that is advocated through media reporting, we are being as anti-human rights person. So having you face that such kind of challenge of being on the other side of it.
Not me, because we never report in that way. But
Yeah, I could just add to that because there is this big distinction always between weather and climate. As this, I mean, the crudest way to put it is that climate is just an average of weather, and averages are just abstract numbers. But in India, we have always covered whether it's monsoon. Right from the 1800s, we've had the Indian Meteorological Department precisely to cover weather vagaries like drought, etc. The the fallout of that is that we tend to associate climate based reporting with changes in weather, but that is not what climate reporting actually is about. Climate is different. It is, I mean, there is this very wonderful, I mean, those of you who are into sci-fi, there is this very wonderful show which is based on a book called The Three-Body Problem. So the essential premise of that is that there is an alien civilization that is detected that, there is this Earth over here. Earth has figured out that they know that we exist. So the whole book, or the three-part book, is about the politics of what happens on how do we deal with this thing that is going to come. Should we be friendly with them? Will they attack us? Will they change us? What will we do? Climate actually is way beyond just weather. It is actually a fundamental change in energy systems. It is basically asking the whole world to actually go away from a commonsensical method, which is to blow fossil fuels and just extrapolate to the maximum our energy, our fossil fuel extraction systems, get developed, become rich, and then think about it, and basically follow the industrial capitalism method of living. Most people just see it as that it is a very slam dunk kind of thing, but actually the whole point of the climate debate actually is asking you to choose something radically different. It is asking you to choose sun, wind, older forms of energy which are actually inefficient even today, but it actually requires a different kind of public commitment to convince most people that this is the only way that you have to pursue and improve. Now, I suspect, and that is the reason this message hasn't really percolated to most people who actually even read of climate change as, as I alluded to earlier, melting glaciers and sea level rise and subsequent changes in, weather cycles, etc. It is this that, and once this becomes more, better understood or better understand, we would probably have political parties in India that are aligned on climate-based issues. We don't have the equivalent of a Green Party in India. Probably I would believe precisely because of this. It's because the full ramifications of what does it mean to be living in using entirely clean energy, the sacrifices that it will entail, the complete turnaround of economies that will happen. It is not always a clean, positive path. That's precisely why India has maintains the positions that it does. We talk about things like climate justice, common but differentiated responsibility, precisely because of questions like this. It is this that I believe at some point will come about, and then it might become a much larger political issue than it is, and then we will actually start having a very different kind of debate vis-a-vis climate reporting or climate understanding.
But to speak to your question also, I think that there is a large-scale reporting on some of the transitions that are happening, which is necessary and important, and what sorts of policies get put into place. And these are sort of approaches that governments or officials take. But I think that it's also really necessary for ground reports to be able to say that the impacts that they're having, for example, Mongabay would sort of report on what impact it's having on the Great Indian Bustard, for example, to have such large-scale renewable projects in a space where they're endangered. And it's not, I'm taking an example of non-human species, and this is across different sort of terrains. But of course, communities should have a say, right, in how some of these projects develop and whether it's safe, whether they want it. And there's great reporting that's happening around that. For example, Land Conflict Watch is doing it, or smaller newsrooms like Behan Box or Third Eye Portal, Khabar Lahariya. And you need all of this to happen because that's what will cause these changes to take place in a manner where it is not anti-human or anti-other species. And we're able to do it in a sort of more democratic sort of manner, right? So I think that all the reporting that we have is important.
So we have a lot of stuff remaining to discuss about, but we have to wind up. So before taking questions, I would like to take this opportunity to thank Switzerland Embassy for sponsoring this session. And now we have 10 more minutes remaining, for the questions. The floor is open for the questions.
Hello, I really enjoyed the session. Thank you for it. My question is, what can journalists do to inform the audience and create a call for action against atrocities like the Great Nicobar Project? And how do we make people realize that every climate story is in fact a human interest story, because it is our lives that are at stake?
I think actually there's been a fair bit of journalistic coverage of the Great Nicobar project. Recently, I think the journalist Raj Shekhar published a piece in the Time magazine in the US. So the thing is, as journalists, I'm not saying we're doing as much as can possibly done, especially for a story like this, which is away from the mainland and requires a lot of, say, at least for a bigger news organization, a lot of clearances and a lot of permissions to even reach the ground and report. And even when you're there, you'll be subject to a lot of restrictions, most likely, while reporting. So it is a hard story to do, but despite that, there have been, a fair bit of stories. But the thing is, it also matters how much of an impact the story has. Like, even if there have been multiple occasions, especially now around the world, where the story of a particular thing has been told repeatedly every single day. However, that's not changing the policy or the narrative. So I think like it's one thing for journalists to do stories about various things, and maybe for this issue definitely much more. But it's another thing for people, people in like common, like people who are electing people to power, or people in positions of power, to respond to this information and kind of change what is happening on the ground.
Next question.
Yeah, thank you to all the panelists. My question was saying that now climate reporting is gaining ground in whatever way. So, should there be more comprehensive kind of a framework in environment and climate reporting based on scientific temperamentality, also contextualized to India? Something that CSC has been doing for a lot of time, and but still it's little niche in its approach. So that should be expanded, because I think CSE does a brilliant work in contextualizing, giving scientific understanding of a lot of rationale behind environment and climate reporting, something that sometimes I feel is missing from a lot of normal mainstream media, that scientific understanding of climate, its terms, whatever it like,
Jacob, you
means.
want to take?
Well, I believe you can't actually force a scientific temperament on a reading public in general, because all said and done, newspapers or other broadcast media are broadcasters. We're just telling stuff out with a loudspeaker. Now, something like Down to Earth has a particular way of reporting and writing stories. We at the Hindu Science and Environment section have a particular way of telling stories. Now, certain stories gain traction, and that will that might inspire other journalists who normally would not delve into scientific issues to cover a story. The best example, for instance, is the COVID-19 coverage. Everybody overnight became medical journalists, and we're talking about the intricacies of spike proteins and RNA combination, right? So it's always a time and circumstances that determine what kind of depth that a newsroom will itself force upon, or its reporters, and that also then, in a very dialectical way, forces us to get better sources, read up more, such that we can then again convey back to an audience which is now more informed than us, than what the state before. My favorite example always is sports journalism, right? I mean, none of us, when you write, we all write stories about, there was a leg glance on the side, and then, at third man, there was some person. Nobody's has brackets explaining what third man and deep mid wicket is, right? Because it is understood. The level of cricket comprehension is very high in this country, so it reflects in the journalism too.
I also think that, like, as an editorial space, we approach stories with a lot of rigor. We fact check everything, but the way that it sort of eventually shows up, we want it to be accessible to a layperson. So oftentimes it will not look like it is sort of a science-led story. But what's gone on behind it is that we've done all of the legwork, and made it easier for the reader to access some of these complicated things.
Yeah, next question.
This is, funnily enough, it's covered in the three-body problem already. It's the pan-species communism argument. To the article, but just in relation to that, does this affect your reporting? The fact that if you have climate change effect on a species that doesn't have any industrial relevance, that
Sorry, any industrial?
Your specific point, it's not human-centric. It's not nothing to do with the fishing industries and all that. Does that affect your reporting of it in any way? And is it given a low priority? Should it be given a higher priority than it is right now? Open to the point.
Shailesh.
So you're basically asking if the story is not human-centric,
Yes.
will you cover it?
Yeah. Is it given a lower priority? Should it be given?
No. So that is what I started my discussion with, is that environment should be treated as whole, right? I will give you a quick example because we don't have time. I was in Sundarbans last month, and there is a very basic practice people do for embankment. They use these urea bags, the plastic bags, to for the embankment. Under the sun, it disintegrates really fast, and that microplastic is getting to the water system, and that is entering the fish system, which in turn gets into humans. And there is a particular cat species called fishing cat. Right now, the scientific evidence is there that the microplastic is found in fishing cat. Right? I was there to report from Bangalore to Sundarbans to report a fishing cat story, which maybe after more scientific backing and research, it will turn out that it is entering the human system as well. So environment should be treated as whole.
One last question. Yeah.
Yeah, when we talk about climate reporting, it is also important to report on the solutions, considering the impact that the solutions could have. I work for a project called Eco India by Scroll.in and DW, and we do environmental solution stories. And considering these solutions are hyperlocal, it helps reach people what kind of solutions can be given to these climate issues, and how and people are getting interested in volunteering into it. When it comes to mainstream media, what are some of the challenges in covering solutions? Or I could see that not many mainstream media focus on climate solutions. What are some of the challenges and where are we at right now? Do we have time?
Okay, I just want to say that with the solutions comes another problem of greenwashing. There are a lot of projects that are being pushed as solutions, but they are not actual solutions, and then there is a lot of marketing for making it look like green. And like Manisha said in the opening one, is that we are not experts. We are not here to give solutions. We are here to give you facts and ground reporting.
Okay, that's it. The rest of the questions, like the panelists will be here outside. You can ask them outside the auditorium. Thank you all. Thank you all for joining.